Welcome back to the All About Audiology podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Lilach Saperstein. And on this podcast, we discuss topics of audiology and how they apply to your life. We're not just talking about audiograms and hearing aids or X's and O's, but everything that goes along with the experience around audiology, whether it is yourself, someone you love, if you're a student of this profession, or one of my colleagues. I welcome you to the podcast. And on today's episode, I'm joined by two very interesting gentlemen, and we are going to be hearing both from the user experience part of things and also a little bit about a nonprofit organization here in Israel that is doing a lot of work for families and patients around these topics. So today I'm joined by Oren Dvoskin, who is a cochlear implant user and will share some of his journey and his story, as well as Damian Kelman, the CEO of Bekol, an organization here in Israel. So welcome, Oren, and hello, Damien. Welcome to the show. So I want to start with you, Oren, and get a little bit of your background and just a little bit of who you are.
Well, thanks for that, Lilach. I always say that I have a bit of an ironic story with hearing impairment. My mom's a special ed teacher, and as a young child, she decided to send myself and my sister to a very unique kindergarten that had a class of both hearing impaired kids and normal hearing kids, and I belonged to the normal hearing kids at the time. My hearing loss was first found only in junior high school. So, long story, I was born in Omaha, Nebraska. We moved to Israel, then moved back to state. So I had a hearing test in junior high, and it came out with a mild hearing loss. Now, that would have lit up a lot of whistles and bells, but apparently not at the time, and even not when I had a special ed mom. We moved back to Israel. Years went on. I entered high school and started failing miserably. We started checking what was going on, and then someone remembered that I had a hearing loss. We did a hearing test again, and I'll never forget the look on the face of my ENT doctor when he saw the results. And basically 2 weeks afterwards, I started using my first set of hearing aids. Although, unfortunately, my hearing kept on deteriorating from then, and I reached a level of profound deafness around the age of 30 when I got my first cochlear implant. And then a second, and then a third, since one of them failed.
Oh boy. Okay, we're going to get into all of that. That's such a great story. First of all, I want to say I relate to you on the moving back and forth because my parents are Israeli, and then we lived in different countries in South America, and then in the States, and then now I live back here now with my husband and kids. So it's like always the ping pong, the third culture or international, all of that, the languages. So I relate to that, and I'm curious about, you mentioned that you had that first mild diagnosis, but no one took it really seriously. Did you feel at the time that you were having any trouble hearing or that you were missing things, or that's just how it was for you, so you didn't really notice it or affect you in any way?
Well, in retrospect, I absolutely knew I had a hearing loss. I suffered from tinnitus basically from the age I could remember myself. I used to have these tinnitus outbreaks, and I used to go and hide under some table in our living room in my parents' house. And also in retrospect, I was always this astronaut kid. I remember even back as first and second grade, when a teacher would ask me a question, I would never know what was going on. And I thought, that's how things are. As many other hearing impaired people, I was able to develop all kinds of tactics and have my processor in my head work overtime, to cope through things until it became really too much.
Yeah, and as your hearing also was deteriorating over that time. And I always just say this for everyone who's listening, that any amount of hearing loss, even mild, which seems mild, not a big deal, actually can have a lot of implications on someone's functioning. So that's a question we get a lot from parents who say, oh, it's maybe not so much. They could hear most of the time, but it really can have a lot of effects. socially, academically. So, and even personality, like you're saying that you were a little spaced out, not paying attention, not on the ball. So, definitely recommend taking a look at that no matter what's going on.
Yeah, I mean, hearing loss is really tricky. You never know what you're missing. It takes also a lot of confidence to be able to function in that environment where you're not really sure of what's going on, and all kinds of tactics. And understand that life is a balancing act and that you have to keep on top of, especially when my hearing loss was degrading, to keep on top of the changes. And, every few years I had to cope with things anew. And you talked about, how audiology isn't all about X's and O's. Then I completely agree with that. The most, the audiologists that had the most profound effect on my life were the ones that were a companion, that were able to hold up a mirror in front of me and say, Oren, this is what's going on. This is what you have to do. If it's a cochlear implant, then yeah, you should really go for that. You're having a really tough time. I'm looking at the wear and tear on your FM system, which means you're probably overusing it and it's time to go on.
Yeah. And that also is telling me that once you had those hearing aids and you had an FM system, you already were doing everything, devices and accessories and trying to do all the communication strategies to try and communicate as best as you could. So tell me a little about that process of coming to the cochlear implant, learning about it, and deciding that was for your next step.
Well, like I said, it was not an ongoing process of coping, basically exhausting the current strategies before moving on. And I think it's more of a process, like you said, on personality and coping wise. So I've been able to do interesting things in life, like volunteer to become an officer in the Israeli army. But every stage required an adaptation also of my hearing. So with the cochlear implant, I think I was clinging on as long as I could to my hearing. At the time, I was 30. Well, that's almost 20 years ago. And there wasn't that much of an experience, at least not in Israel, with late onset, progressive hearing loss adults. And the few stories that I was hearing was just too good to be true. On one hand, and on the other, I had enough functional hearing that I'd actually call the clinic with my mobile phone to set an appointment. And they'd be like, hey, Oren, so you want to set a call for an assessment? I'm like, right. So how are you calling me? I said, yeah, with my mobile phone. So sir, call us again in half a year because your hearing is too good. So that took a while, and I think the decision to go in the end for the implant had a lot of apprehension. I even went through some consulting around that, and it just changed my life. I mean, that's a whole different podcast that I'm sure you've already talked about.
Oh, but I'd love to hear your take on it as well. I think, just on the comment of what you said, that you called and they're like, you hear too well. Now, even, I don't know about then, but for sure now, the cochlear implant is not only for completely profound hearing loss across all the frequencies. There are hybrid models, and the cochlear implant can actually be very beneficial for lots of different patients with different hearing losses. So I think that, that's not true anymore, that even if you can succeed at having a phone conversation, that doesn't take away from other communication challenges around high frequencies and things like that. So again, I just have to put on my audiology hat and put that out there, that getting an evaluation is just getting an evaluation to see what your hearing is, what your status is, are you a candidate or not, and what the options are. So, it's not a decision just to go in for that if anyone is at that stage. And you also mentioned about how adults is a whole different story. There's so much focus on kids, on babies, and on helping that population, but there's so much room also for adults And that's, I think we're going to turn to Damien a little bit and hear a little more about what Bekol does. So welcome, Damien.
Hello, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here with you. So for your followers, probably not in Israel, let's just state that according to the Israeli Central Bureau of Statistics, approximately 700,000 Israelis are coping with hearing loss. And of course, it's a phenomenon that's more common among older adults. I mean, in Israel, as in the rest of the Western world, at least, every third person over the age of 65 and every second person over the age of 75 is hard of hearing. And hearing loss, as you for sure know, and I guess your followers as well, hearing loss severely hinders your ability to communicate with the surroundings, increases the chances for dementia, causes frustration, and all kinds of other consequences that come along with it. And basically what Bekol does is promote optimal hearing rehabilitation to reduce this phenomena. For the last 2 decades and more, Bekol has been improving people with hearing disabilities quality of life and welfare, empowering them, facilitating their integration into the general society in an independent way, and advocating for the rights, basically. And Bekol is a leader, is considered a leader in Israel among non-profit organizations in all the field of hearing rehabilitation for people 18 and onwards. Let's just say that Bekol's activity has a wide impact in all fields of society, delivered by a broad range of programs and services that include public awareness campaigns, diagnosing hearing loss, guidance and consultation, support and job placement, promoting an accessible public space and accessibility in general, and all kinds of services that we offer, either people dealing with hearing loss, their families, or even caretakers and all kinds of people, just providing services that need to know how to interact with people with hearing loss in a more effective way.
Wow. So thank you both for all that information. And I know that the majority of the listeners of the podcast are actually, there is no majority. They're all over the world. My stats is like, it lights up the whole map. I love every single one of you listeners. And from all the countries around, in Asia, in Europe, in Africa, in South America, North America, everywhere, basically. I don't think there's any scientists in Antarctica listening to the podcast just yet. But basically the listeners are international. And I wanted to spotlight this, with the work that you are doing and the experience that you've had, Oren, with an organization, and what a big difference it can make, not only for the personal experience of the people who are involved, but how you are then making lasting, impactful change on systems, healthcare advocacy, and laws and legislation, like you mentioned. So wherever you are in the world listening to this, check out your local organizations and see what's happening and how to get involved and what you can get and what you can give. That's the power of this kind of community. So that's incredible.
Yeah, no, I mean, it worked both ways. I absolutely get it. And it gave me the shivers to hear you talk about your personal experience as well, because that is exactly what we do at Bekol. I mean, we fight for the rights of people with hearing loss and with hearing impairments in all kinds of environments, including the academic field. And want to make sure you get the most out of the things we've accomplished. I mean, if you're going to be using the different services you're entitled to in the good way, I mean, and you're eligible to, either if it's cochlear implants or hearing aids or accessibility services, that is the whole story of Bekol. That's what we are there for. And actually we understand, and I guess everyone with an interest in audiology understands as well, that you shouldn't work harder than you have to. I mean, if there is technology and there is services allowing you to make the most out of your experience and to get a starting point on equality of opportunities from the best place we can provide, I mean, you should use them.
Yeah, no, I'd like to say, yeah, so that is a lot, and Bekol does impressive stuff, but I wanted to share from my personal perspective, maybe not that much as Bekol, but as, you know, we talked until now about technology, about cochlear implants, about FM systems, right? But in the end, there's a person that's coping with all of that. And part of being a person with hearing impairment is you need that support. So I've been a member of Bekol since the day it was founded. I used to be a board member of Bekol for several years. And my experience with Bekol was, first of all, that it was my first touching point with other hearing impaired people. I barely met anyone else with a hearing loss beforehand. And the first few years when I was, you know, hanging around Bekol were probably my best years socially. I suddenly had lots of friends, and we used to go out to parties, and we used to go out together. You know, I felt like, you know, a plant needs to have, or a tree needs to have roots in the right place in order to bloom. And that's one of the things that I found in Bekol. From then it also progressed. So when I met my partner, who's now my wife, then we went to one of Bekol's courses that they organize. It's an immersive course about coping with hearing loss from all kinds of different aspects. Bekol was also one of the first places that I heard about the cochlear implant through a lecture. And they hold these amazing events. So they have this sing-along event for hearing impaired individuals, right? So, you know, people with a hearing loss sometimes are afraid of singing because, you know, it sounds all messed up and they're not familiar with the words in the song. So Bekol holds this event that's a sing-along that's accessible for people with hearing impairments, that have balloons in the audience and, of course, captions. So it's really empowers people. And this is on the personal side, but also on the advocacy side, the organization has done amazing things. I paid for my first cochlear implant. It wasn't in the Israeli health basket yet. And because of Bekol's, you know, fight to improve legislation, then my second hearing impairment was financed by the Israeli healthcare systems. There's now captions, mandatory captions in all TV systems. They've now helped in reducing the cost for hearing aids. They've passed extremely important accessibility laws. So I'm, you know, it's maybe contrary to being hearing impaired, but I'm the head of marketing at a cybersecurity company, right? Most of my day, I hold calls just like these, speaking with people from all over the world, and I'm using now an accessory device that I received through the workplace and lots of other accessory devices. And one of the reasons I could receive that was through advocacy from Bekol. So that's just a bit of, you know, of examples from this very wide breadth of activities that Damien described.
Yeah. We also have so many parents who listen to the show who have young children, babies. They're just learning, or they've been dealing for the last several years with their babies and children. And they often have this question of, what will my child's opportunities be? Will they have friends? And what about identity? And all these questions that parents have in general, but specifically in this topic about when we worry about our kids. And I think it's so important to hear that maybe the thing you're afraid of is actually their ticket for connection and community and friendship and going to advocacy workshops with your wife. I love that. It's something, yeah.
I totally agree. I mean, like advocacy, especially for cochlear implants. So basically, after I got my first CI, I sort of, how do you say, I sort of bootstrapped cochlear implant advocacy in Israel, right? So in the States, yeah, it's very well organized, maybe too organized, right? by the different CI companies. But in Israel, we got along on our own, and then were helped by organizations like Bekol. And I even found myself, with just this international flavor that you talked about, I found myself consulting to Cochlear Europe on how they could jumpstart CI advocacy in different regions around the world. And one of the important components of doing that is teaming up with local NGOs like Bekol, that would exist in different places. And there are lots of other stuff. I participated a few years ago in the Deaf Olympics, in the road cycling events, right? So a totally different community experience, gathering people from all over the world. So my experience as an individual with a hearing loss is that you have to connect to those communities. It gives you so much empowerment, to cope with your daily life.
Yeah, I was just speaking to a student who mentioned that an university student, that she didn't want to go to the Office of Disabilities and get transcription in the classes or, preferential seating or whatever else she could get. Well, that's not relevant this semester and this year online. But anyway, captioning for Zoom, all the things that she was eligible for. And she didn't want to do it because she was so embarrassed and she was worried that it was going to affect the perception of the teachers on how they should treat her. And we had a conversation about the teachers will have a perception that you missed the question, that you're not participating, that you don't know what's going on. That's going to be their perception without it. And when you do disclose this and get the help, it will be a different conversation, more in your benefit. So yeah, we have that conversation a lot. And I'm interested. Yes, please.
Yeah, I want to add on that I think you have to have a really positive, even combative approach, right? So look, it took me twice to finish the Israeli officers course, the Israeli Army officers course. It took me, a couple of years extra to finish my BA degree. And I sometimes still wake up in the middle of the night because, dreaming that someone audited their grading systems and found out that I actually did skip several courses. And in every step along that line, I unashamedly did the maximum I could, leveraging, organizations like Bekol and other organizations to get whatever shortcut and whatever benefit that I could, just to get a slightly better starting point in whatever path I chose, right? So people that have a hearing loss, it's harder. It might take twice as long. You might fail more, so you have to use every resource that you can, and even maybe have some chutzpah in doing that in order to succeed, sometimes just as much as as your regular hearing impaired people. And don't be ashamed about that, right? So Bekol and Damien, they're partners of yours. Find how they can help. Be very diligent about that.
I remember the quote that we say sometimes for kids is that your child should have the opportunity to ignore you on purpose. That they should hear you enough to say, I'm not listening. Okay, so I have one question for you, Damien, as well, about the organization. A lot in this world, in the conversation we have here on the podcast, often about deaf culture and deaf identity and sign language as a modality of communication and community. In what ways do you see collaboration?
I'll say the only disadvantage. Sorry, Damien. I'll say the only disadvantage about doing that is that it's harder afterwards to skip classes. So, or if the teacher is used to you handing over the FM and sitting in the front row, and you're not there, they say, "Hey, Oren, I wore my my shirt that had the place to put the FM. You weren't here today." On the other hand, if there's a class that does have mandatory participation, then you can say, "Nah, that's too hard for someone with a hearing loss. I need to be able to chill out once in a while," right? So So sorry, Damien, go ahead.
Yeah, I'd like to add that also from my personal perspective, as a hearing person, and from Bekol's perspective, I mean, it's super important people are able to fulfill their potential and live their life the way they choose to. And that's one of the reasons we work for all kinds of accessibility means in all kinds of different channels, let's say. Bekol started its path as the organization for hard of hearing people in Israel and deafening people in Israel, and it is the Israeli representative of that group of people for different international organizations and forums, including the World Health Organization. But for several years, Bekol has included in its agenda working towards accessibility and equality of opportunities for all kinds of different deaf and deafening and hard of hearing people, either if it's by sign language and accessibility in translation into sign language and captions and all different kinds of accessibility means.
I think you asked maybe about deaf versus hearing impaired. Yeah, so I had this really amazing story since I represented Israel in the Summer Deaf Olympics 2013 in the road cycling events. I don't speak sign language. I tried learning a bit, but I forgot. It was very interesting because I found myself at a disadvantage point there. That was one thing. First of all, because you have to disconnect everything, all of your hearing devices. And without the implants, I can't hear anything at all. So my coach would have to write to me on this like chalkboard instructions. And then one of the really funny events I had was in the closing ceremony. I started walking around and I met an athlete from Saudi Arabia. And he ran up to me all signing and happy and all. And, he's asking me in sign language, where am I from? And I knew how to answer that. I said, Israel, which is a sign of a beard, like a long beard of like Herzl. And he's like, signing the beard, Israel, yeah, cool, and signing great. And then he kept on speaking and speaking. And I said, wait. I don't speak sign language. I tried signing. And he sort of looked at me and he said, oh, he said, are you hearing impaired? And then he signed hearing impaired. And I said, yes. And he said, and you're not deaf? And I said, yes. And he said, and you don't speak sign language? And I said, no. So he said, go away. And then I found myself sitting on the sidewalk with some of the Japanese athletes, because apparently they have a completely different sign language system and they couldn't find anybody else to talk to but besides them. So I joined the Japanese group. It was an amazing experience. And I sometimes, I visit the States, and sometimes when I visit the States, I sometimes feel that I'm not politically correct, that I don't sign. People see the implants and I walk up to, Starbucks, and then the cashier starts signing, and I'm like, whoa, so it's unfortunate that I haven't learned, haven't learned it, but I think the balance, nevertheless, of connecting with your hearing impairment is extremely important.
Definitely. So I just wanted to go back a minute to, what we were talking about, identity, and with that spectrum of the deaf and hard of hearing and hearing impaired experience. In fact, there's a lot of pushback many times when you even use the expression hearing impaired, because people will say that's ableist. And now you're saying there's a problem, there's an impairment, even hearing loss, that there's a loss here, this is a medical model. But I kind of, always want to just listen to everyone who comes from wherever they're coming from. If people say this is my cultural identity, the language that's in my home and community, and there is a very strong deaf identity, then that's one experience. And if someone was a late deafened adult, that's a totally different experience. Someone has high frequency hearing loss, someone has low frequency hearing loss, from mild to profound. That's why I think that the audiology world, the experience is so varied. And we have to move away from some of the shaming on both sides of, if you sign, you're abusing your child. If you don't do a cochlear implant, you're abusing your child. Like, what? Everyone calm down. We want to know what the options are and then do what's right for you, for your family. And I really appreciate that you shared so openly, Oren, about that experience of being isolated and excluded in that context, and the other experiences of being embraced. So everyone has to find their place in life in every context. So this is one of those things that I hope to bring with the podcast: a little more acceptance, inclusion, and calm down about the terms. Like that's something that's a goal for me. And yeah, I'm really hopeful that there will be more efforts for accessibility. One of the big stories that is always about Zoom, and are they going to provide the automatic captioning or not? Are they going to provide that at a cost, or is it going to be free for everyone? This is one of those topics that I've been following this story. So I think from every perspective, people are kind of trying to do as much as they can to help and see how life can be more connection, more conversation, more relationships, because that's the ultimate goal. So I'm so grateful to have you today. And if you have any advice, I'd like, advice from Oren and then advice from Damien for any of our listeners about, the world of audiology, wherever they are.
One of the things that's also very unique about Bekol is that it was founded by, and for many years managed by, also by the board of directors and their upper management by hearing impaired individuals. So the first three founders were hearing impaired. Their CEOs, their first two CEOs were hearing impaired individuals. For many years, you would never see anyone. All the board members would be hearing impaired individuals. So it's very okay.
Up until this day, sorry for interrupting. I mean, because chairperson and all board members are hearing impaired people, members of the organization, because we should probably add that because is an organization of members first and foremost.
Yeah, so it's a self-help organization. One of our board members is also actually my CI surgeon, Professor Michal Luntz, who's also a bilateral CI user. However, the landscape progresses, and the last two CEOs of Bekol have been professionals. So Damien's predecessor of Au.D, and now Damien, are professional CEOs, and we see that the landscape is still becoming more challenging, especially now with COVID. Bekol, like many other NGOs, not just in Israel, but around the world, actually operate different projects for governments or operate projects that depended a lot on having a face-to-face audience. So that has also created challenges for the organization on one hand, and on the other, I can share that someone with a hearing loss, COVID has been tough, right? Suddenly everyone is wearing masks, so it's hard to lip read. Everyone is using Zoom, and suddenly there aren't captions in Zoom. So there's still a lot of advocacy that needs to be done. People are feeling alone during the pandemic, coping with their hearing loss alone, and then services from organizations like Bekol are much more needed. But on the other hand, like everybody else, they've been impacted dramatically by the situation. Now, as a longtime board member, I can say that Bekol has always managed itself financially very, very well. But, these times are challenging. We've been able to work through 2020 very well, but now have reached a decision that we need some help. So we've launched a crowdfunding campaign. I'm again from marketing and a cybersecurity company, so I started telling, Damien, hey, we should do some crowdfunding. And I saw another organization that it worked well. And I sort of helped push them to that. Saying, hey, at least we'll return the investment. And so far, it's been an impressive success.
Mm-hmm. And yet we need as much help as we might get, because as Oren said, the needs on the ground are only increasing, and COVID-19 has a big part for that, for sure. Challenges and difficulties have been going all over the roof, and we've also had to adapt our programs and services to the new reality, to the new normal. I mean, the hearing out loud courses Bekol provides, that Oren was mentioning before, have entirely moved to the Zoom environment, and all kinds of different services of guidance we provide has also moved mostly to the cybernetic sphere. And we definitely need as much help as we can get for next years to keep providing, because we understand the situation is not going back to what we knew before, not only in the matters of the pandemic, but also in the matters of the political crisis we're facing in Israel. I mean, people over the world probably don't know, but we've been through a year without a government budget, and that makes things very difficult for organizations like us, providing the government with services that they enable other providers to do, because basically they need the organizations to be there in the ground and helping people throughout their needs, their previous challenges, and the new ones that we've dealt with in the last few months because of the pandemic.
So thanks for that, Lilach. I think that on this call, I think this call is very interesting, since we have 4 different partners here. We have you as a professional, we have Damien as part of a support organization, I have me as the user, and we have technology on the call. And every person needs to find the right balance of what works for them for optimizing all these parts in order to achieve whatever you want to achieve. Lilach, as a care provider, everyone else who's listening on this call, please get out of your box, get out of your element, get out of your comfort zone. You are so significant in holding a mirror in front of your patients and showing them where they can go to and taking them along that path. A hearing aid to work well doesn't have to be tuned perfectly. It has to help. It doesn't always have to, catch all the sounds. Damien from Bekol, you saw how we just, in this conversation, how organizations like these can connect the dots and empower people. So you have to understand that you're doing lots of activities, but then look at the needs of these specific people, what they need and what they want from you, and work together. And as myself, as a user, my personal approach was to always make the most out of the technology, but I could never do that without the help of you guys on this call. So it's all about a synergy and working together. And in times like these during COVID, please do reach out and help your local organizations. It's extremely important.
Absolutely. And I want to relate to what Oren was mentioning. One thing we've learned, especially during the last few months, is that it takes a lot of raising awareness among the general public as well. I mean, and that's something we can all do from our different angles and perspectives. So if you're in this world of hearing loss and audiology, you can probably put out the message of how we can, all of us, relate in a way that's more effective in matters of communication. Let's start with the most basic, to allow people to understand what you have to say, to provide an environment that supports the possibility of listening or getting the message with the technology, without the technology. We all have learned the hard way the last few months how badly a situation which is medical in the first place, but urges all of us to wear masks, in a moment turns the reality backwards for people using technology, even years and decades. So it's our responsibility, all of us, to make the most, to enable communication the way, in each and every way we can.
Thank you, Damien. So we are going to have a link to your crowdfunding campaign in the show notes, as well as a full transcript of today's conversation, as with all the podcast episodes. So I'm so grateful to both of you for joining us on the podcast today. And if people want to reach out to you or be in touch, I think you're both on LinkedIn. Is there anywhere else you would like to be linked anywhere? Instagram, that's where I hang out.
Yeah, I'll be glad to be contacted on LinkedIn or email. That you can publish my email in the show notes. I'm always glad to, help, or Facebook. I'm always glad to speak with other adults or parents of children. I'm busy, but I'm always glad to help, and even for a short word. So please do reach out.
Mm-hmm. And as for Bekol, you can either Google us or just email me directly via LinkedIn or directly by email. Facebook works as well, whatever is comfortable for you.
Excellent. So I will have all that linked in the show notes. Thank you so much for being a listener of the All About Audiology podcast. If you can leave a review on iTunes or wherever you listen to your podcast, that is so, so appreciated. And like I mentioned, I do hang out on Instagram at All About Audiology podcast, and I am loving when you tag me, when you tell me you're listening. I recently had a listener from Australia who said she had a 4-hour drive and she listened to like 4 episodes back to back. So thank you for listening, Genevieve. And I would love to hear from you. And thank you for listening. This is the All About Audiology podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Lilach Saperstein.